This is Darren with RebootCongress.net, and I'm here today talking to Chris Horner of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And Chris, I was wondering if you could begin by telling us first a little bit about the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and then also about your role with CEI.
Well, CEI is what's called a classical liberal think tank that is advocating limited government, individual economic liberty, open markets, and so on. When it comes to energy and the environment, which is where I've spent most of my time with them, we advocate what is easily understood but flies in the face of, I guess, the widely promoted conventional wisdom, which our argument is that wealthier is healthier, wealthier is cleaner. Wealth is not the disease, wealth is the cure. Go look at the difference between Central Virginia, a very nice part of it where I live, and Detroit, and tell me why is one clean and one isn't. One is wealthy, and wealthier communities, societies pay for cleaning things up and adding more and more environmental regulation and so on. So we advocate sensible regulation, which is not what our opponents regulate. They propose regulation for regulation's sake because you just can't be trusted with certain freedoms. You might use them. My role with them began, I was innocently practicing law about in the late 90s with a firm now known as Bracewell and Giuliani. It's a Texas-based firm, obviously with a New York component. And a client asked me to be Director of Federal Government Relations. That company was Enron. I was there about 3 weeks. My second day, I sat in on a meeting of what you call Baptists and bootleggers, which is rent-seeking businesses like Enron, BP, American Gas Association was with them, Niagara Mohawk Power and others, who were sitting around with the Union of Concerned Scientists and others trying to figure out how to get a global warming treaty to direct taxpayer and ratepayer money to them and impose UCS and others' ideological agenda in the name of catastrophic man-made global warming. Enron and BP had built these businesses of windmills and solar panels and gas pipelines, and they wanted to support green groups to run around scaring people to accept policies that would add real value to these losers that these companies bought. Enron Wind is now known as GE Wind. GE is now pushing the carbon tax and so on. So that's a big picture where we come from when we conduct our transparency campaign, which is looking at EPA, Department of Energy, and Treasury.
Okay. Now, I understand that CEI filed a suit against EPA in September. What's the objective of that lawsuit, and can you give me a little bit of background on the lawsuit?
We filed several. Two, I think you might be referring to. They both involve emails, and they both involve the efforts, which get very elaborate, as, by the way, I detail in my new book, The Liberal War on Transparency. They get very elaborate. In these two particular cases, one involves a senior EPA official who has a history of rotating between a green pressure group and government, and when he's in government, he creates an email account, first name dot last name dot agency acronym, whatever it is, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or Department of Natural Resources, DNR, or EPA, at gmail.com. That is, he, like many I've discovered, have moved their public service onto private email accounts, private computers, even private servers to keep them free from scrutiny from people like us. Now, we have sued because you can't do that, and moving your public service over to private resources doesn't make it any less public, and yet we've caught them doing this on a very widespread basis.
Wait, can I stop you right there for a second? You
Yeah.
say you've caught them doing this. What evidence do you have of them doing this? Like, what sort of records do you have at this point?
Well, the thing about correspondence is there's always somebody on the other end, isn't there? So we submitted, for example, in this particular case, exemplars of two of his accounts where he does this, emails he sent from these accounts. I just got an email. They just produced in the lawsuit some email threads today, but heavily redacted, I'm told. So I'll see what other evidence we now have since we've sued. In another one, it really traces back to a lawsuit Mark Levin filed back in the last days of the Clinton-Gore administration, when Carol Browner was establishing these midnight regulations, laying landmines for George Bush that would lead to sort of a administration-defining ad campaigns. You may remember an adorable little girl holding up her glass of water on a television ad saying, "Mommy, may I please have some more arsenic in my water?" That was set up by a midnight regulation, laid there, a landmine for George Bush to have to say this is unnecessary, doesn't help public health and the environment. It just adds cost for no benefit, and you're obviously doing this to make me undo it, and then you can frame everything I do for 4 or 8 years as being anti-environment, anti-children, and so on. It's how they play the game. Well, Mark Levin's lawsuit led to the court in D.C. issuing a preservation order telling Carol Browner to preserve her records. Well, the Department of Justice said they didn't tell her about it, and hours later she came storming into her office and demanded that they reformat her hard drive and erase her backup tapes.
If she allegedly did not know about this order, for what reason did she want the hard drive reformatted? She
said she didn't use her computer for email anyway, which is, this comes up in a minute, so remember that. And she said she just had a kid who, her son, who played video games on her computer, and she wanted it to be properly formatted for the Bush administration coming in, with or without the W on the keyboard, I'm not sure. But, that's how they were in those last days. They really were concerned that the computers be in great shape. So that was her argument. It led to thousands of hard drives being pulled from thousands of computers, stored in cabinets and closets, and a big cleanup operation. And they finally found her hard drive, and the FBI did conduct a forensic examination and concluded it had been reformatted. So what we had was Carol Browner saying, I didn't use my computer for email anyway. Flash forward to when I'm finishing the liberal war on transparency, and I'm plowing through these deathless Government Accountability Office reports so you don't have to, and I saw one referencing a particular EPA memo. And in this EPA memo, they referenced, I obtained that under the Freedom of Information Act, which I'll just call FOIA.
Okay.
And I got that email, that memo, and it was to the National Archivist saying, NARA, we have a problem. We have just discovered certain records management issues here. In the 90s, it appears that the administrator, Carol Browner, initiated a alias email account, a black account, because it wouldn't be fair to expect her to use the publicly known address, and so she designed an address for herself. We can't reconstruct this because it turns out this account was set on auto-delete. Now, in the memo, they said reportedly she didn't use her email anyway, so no records were lost. But that's just reportedly. All we know is the hard drive was reformatted, and she engaged in some very strange behavior of creating her own address to which only she had access and her assistant, which the memo says few, if any, in the agency know about, and so on. Well, so I sought records relating to the creation, assignment, and use of Carol Browner's alias account. And they came back saying no records, which is strange because in 2008 when they wrote this memo, they had enough records to write this memo. So we're persisting in court with that. The second one was about assignment and creation for Lisa Jackson. They sent me some letters, and yes, her alias account was created. She's the current EPA administrator, the one who called my FOIA requests criminal in a speech at Berkeley Law School, which explains the subtitle of the book.
Well, help me understand, why would she call your FOIA requests criminal?
Well, inconvenient apparently is synonymous with criminal to these people because they were very inconvenient. I was seeking, for example, we're in court now with the University of Virginia for their now admitted cache of what are called hockey stick records. These are emails and things that go back to the global warming hockey stick that was defrocked later. And UVA had told the lawmaker, no, after a detailed search, we can confirm that we destroyed those records. And then the Attorney General of Virginia said, after ClimateGate, that scandal, he'd like to take a look. And when this law enforcement officer asked the same question, they had a very different answer. Oh, those. Yes, we found them under the sofa cushion here. So I was in court when I heard this acknowledged, and I and the lawmaker FOIA'd the records. UVA and the entire academic and left establishment objected, and we've been in court since. So Lisa Jackson didn't care for that. She called it criminal, and she otherwise was rather incoherent in describing it, but it was pretty clear what she was talking about. So Jackson, the third prong of my request, in fact, the third request that we're in court on in this same suit, sought Lisa Jackson's use of her alias account or accounts for that use the words coal, climate, endanger. They call their backdoor cap and trade the endangerment finding, and MACT, which is just an acronym for EPA regulations. Well, so we filed on that because they said they just didn't respond, which is something I'm encountering quite a lot lately when it's uncomfortable. And when we did file, they demanded an extension until after the election before they reply, which I've also found in 3 cases. And so that led to the suit that I believe you're talking about, but it's part and parcel of several. I have found them using private servers, private computers. They have ongoing record electronic cyber bonfires at one agency and so on. And I found an awful lot.
I want to come back to that, but roughly how many email addresses do you suspect Lisa Jackson has of these alias email addresses? And what are they used for?
Well, they're used for the same reason anybody else uses email, except that this way no one's likely to find them. That's the only thing I can imagine. The original theory was, well, of course, an administrator has to have email, and it wouldn't be fair to have to sort through all of what the unwashed masses correspond with her about to find the ones she actually wants to read. And so I don't know how many she has. I will tell you that I was contacted by 2 former fairly senior EPA officials, career, both, not political. The one did hold a political position at one point, and told me that Richard Windsor was one of Lisa. They said one of, and I could show you the email. I was contacted anonymously by one of them, but I did ultimately trace back who it was before I went with this. And it was affirmed by a second source. Richard Windsor was one of, they said, Lisa Jackson's aliases for her emails, which, I don't know. What's your guess, Darren? Why would you create such an alias that no one is likely to figure out who? For all I know, that was, so far as I know, that was one of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, I'm told, or you suggest it might have possible other origins.
Let's just talk a little bit of background there first. I saw your reporting first in the Daily Caller and then over in the National Review on this issue, and a friend of mine contacted me about the name Richard Windsor and suggested that, in fact, this Richard Windsor was one Richard Lee Windsor, who was an environmental attorney in Florida, who died December 7th, 2008. He has corresponded with Carol Browner, and I don't know of any connection specifically to Lisa Jackson. But in exploring who this Richard Windsor is, I'm kind of curious why you think this Richard Windsor account is tied to Lisa Jackson. Like, what evidence do you have that suggests that, other than testimony of these high-level EPA people?
Oh, that's sufficient.
Okay.
I've had people contact me saying, I know this was one of her alias accounts. You definitely need to seek these records. And this person said, you ought to seek private email accounts with the same name. This is somebody who I checked had a senior executive service SES position with the agency in the relevant areas, and someone else who also was involved in the cleanup after the Browner debacle confirmed this for me. So I don't know what other evidence I need to point out that I'm informed that one of Lisa Jackson's aliases is Richard Windsor. Now, we shall find out because we sued.
I guess the reason that I bring this up is, couldn't it be Carol Browner, still doing stuff? Because there seems to be a relationship dating back to the 90s between this Richard Windsor in Florida and Carol Browner.
I don't know. Anything's possible, and I do hope we find out. But I will tell you that this EPA memo, which led to all this, which I reveal actually for the first time in the book, which was just released last month, it set forth a really disturbing pattern of behavior. If you remember, this initiated, and it says Carol Browner designed her address. And then after she had her hard drive reformatted, and I'm told by somebody involved in the process who briefed the court, the people who testified said that was strange language for her. She didn't speak that way. She didn't use reformatted means erase. She didn't say, she didn't use sort of street lingo for I need you to clear it or clean it or she came in with a term of art, seemingly having been briefed by somebody who knew what they were talking about, saying reformatted.
Correct.
And then she says, but I didn't use my computer for email anyway. And then we find out she actually designed an alias account for herself that an EPA memo also says was set on auto-delete and they can't recreate. And now I know Lisa Jackson's using it, and I just want to know. Let me tell you one reason I want to know.
Okay.
I described this in the book. There is somebody who is no longer a senior official with NOAA. NOAA is a Department of Commerce. You now know them as a global warming activist agency. During an appeal of one of my FOIAs, she had her home computer and home email accounts searched for responsive records because she acknowledged using them for public service, which makes it no longer private to that extent. Well, the reason this happened, and there was an Inspector General report about this, is because when people like Steve McIntyre, the Canadian statistician who debunked the hockey stick first, when he was asking for records and two other people, she was serving as the gatekeeper, and that's one of these problems with FOIA. The person conducting the search is usually the person who has the most to hide. And this person was saying, these records they want, I think I was really working for the United Nations when I produced or received these. So I'm going to say there are no records because to the extent there are any responsive records, why, they would be UN records. Well, they tried that with me. I immediately hung up the phone, memorialized that claim in writing. 3 days later, they essentially abandoned that claim. But it struck me. This is how they were foiling perfectly, sound requests for records by saying, I think these aren't responsive because I think I was really working for there was no evidence she was seconded to the UN, no evidence she was delegated. In fact, they affirmed, the Inspector General affirmed she was not. It was just a way to keep people from seeing what they're up to, which is a Supreme Court term of art when it comes to FOIA, believe it or not, what your government is up to. So I don't think it would be, I think it would be near-fetched, not far-fetched to imagine a senior official who clearly doesn't want people reading their public mail. Nobody wants anybody reading their private mail. That's not what's at issue here. Doesn't want people reading the public service mail, goes to the lengths of setting up whatever, Richard Windsor or other alias accounts, for them to say, I got this FOIA request for my EPA emails. Since they don't know about this account, they can't possibly be asking for records on this account, right? That's precisely the same logic which was used serially at NOAA by this person who no longer works for them. And so what I'd like to know is when Lisa Jackson's turning over her discussions about the possibly most disastrous regulatory suite to ever be implemented out of Washington, is she turning over the records from all of her accounts? The answer may be absolutely. But right now, all I know is this EPA memo has set forth an awful lot of questions that need to be answered.
What do you think the next steps are in order to drive the transparency that you're seeking?
Well, we're going to have to continue. It's up to citizen journalists like you, and by the way, you are media under FOIA. You can get expedited treatment and your fees waived. Everybody with a newsletter or a blog, you have to get engaged. It's difficult to politicize this and to get away with it if more of us do more than light 1,000 fires in the hills, but actually get engaged. That's why the last chapter of the book is a how-to. How to target your questions.
Tell me a little bit about that. What do you go over in the how-to section?
Well, how to narrowly focus your request to give them the least wiggle room possible. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If they perceive an inch, they'll take a mile or two. You have to target your request, target the office to the extent you can, the email accounts, but in some cases, as you know, that can backfire. Target your timeline. Look for pincer movement if you can. I exposed what the Investors Business Daily called the big wind cover-up, which they called as big as ClimateGate, by going not only through Department of Energy headquarters, which stonewalled me, but through a regional office, which wasn't so schooled in stonewalling. And that's where I got the records, because, again, the beauty of correspondence is there's more than one party involved. So how to look for back doors, how to avoid the most commonly abused exemptions, and how to avoid the likely tricks in advance, and if they pull them, how to defeat them. It's very much in my interest that people know how to do this and do this right. That's why the how-to.
Okay. I read through the FOIA I think you submitted, I think it was the November 12th FOIA. I was surprised. It was like 20 pages long.
But you tweak that. A lot of it's boilerplate. You just tweak it to your circumstances. It shouldn't take you more than a half hour if you have thought about your FOIA in advance. You just tailor your request.
And when you say most of it's boilerplate, are you talking about, like, you sort of had kind of what you wanted up front, and then there's, like, all this how to segregate things out and don't, play fast and loose with just giving, with delaying things because it's not in the correct format and stuff like that.
Right. Now, for example, view that as heading off alleys they might escape down. Each of those pages is heading off alleys they have shown me they'd like to try to escape down. For example, we just filed suit against the Treasury Department for carbon tax documents. And we asked quite plainly, and you always have to do this, if you possess the records in electronic format, provide them as such. Otherwise, photocopies are acceptable. Even in this case, you know what Treasury did? They came back and said, in order to impose a barrier, they said, you'll have to give us $1,400 because we'll have to stand at a Xerox machine for so long to photocopy these 7,300 emails. Well, I looked it up, and the E in email stands for electronic. The default format is electronic. All you do is what they do with me every week, which is just save it to a disk and throw it in the mail. They clearly don't want to. So you're not always, but if you're onto something, you quite often are dealing with people who do not want you to get the information that you seek because you're onto something. So view those pages as ways to try to head off alleys they're going to try to run down, and you just tweak them to your circumstances.
To what extent do you go over the state-level sunshine laws?
Yeah, not so much sunshine, but the FOIA. Sunshine and is a slightly different animal, which is also important. But right now, what I want us to do is master the FOIA for the following reason. Open meetings and things like that are great. The freedom of information laws exist in every state, and they are all modeled after the federal. The principles trickle down. They translate. Federal precedent is usually, but not always, applicable. And that goes down to your city council, your school board. I'm working with local radio hosts here where I live on some shady things because they're less sophisticated usually at hiding what they're up to. And it's very important that whatever it is, if you sense something, if you know something, if you're told something, ask questions. There's nothing threatening or hostile about this. The only threatening or hostile thing is when they don't play ball with you because these are all records are presumed public unless they fall into one of non-exemptions at the federal level, and it's generally, but not specifically, the same throughout the states.
Okay. Do you have any other final thoughts?
No, get involved, read the how-to, and there's also the salacious stuff, the emails I reveal in the book about during Solyndra, and this ongoing, I found what is on its face a criminal operation out of one agency where they're bringing in private computers. I mean, you have to know about these things.
That going back, you had mentioned the bonfire. Could you go through what you're talking about there? It sounded like destruction of data, and I just want to understand where you're going with that.
It is. It's destruction of records on its face in violation of not just federal law, but Title 18, the criminal code. So we're trying to figure out, given we apparently don't have an attorney general who's interested in this, since this admission came through the Department of Justice and they're disinterested. We're trying to figure out if the court were before we'll find this of interest and seek to pursue it. What we got is I found one agency was running a third-party activist website out of the agency on taxpayer time using taxpayer resources. Details are in the book. I sought them. They explained away. We ended up filing suit. They explained away why they weren't producing more records. And by the way, you're dealing with somebody who, after we point this out, the people running the website go onto the website and erase all the time and date stamps. Well, of course we had obtained copies beforehand, knowing who we're dealing with. And so what happens is they said, well, we're not turning over lots of emails discussing this because, you see, there's a rather sophisticated operation going on here. They bring in a computer from outside, purchased by the taxpayer under a grant, but not owned by the taxpayer. Using this, therefore, non-official computer, they access the government computer. When they access the records under the system they've set up, it destroys all traces on the federal computer, on their spool, they said, in this affidavit filed in federal court by the Department of Justice, believe it or not, and I reveal the affidavit in the book. They said that so the only traces of the record are on this computer they brought into the office, which is under a federal maintenance contract, but, they've refused us access to it to conduct an examination for traces of these records. So you see, we're really at a loss here. Well, I suppose, but you know what? on its face, that violates Title 18 of the U.S. Code. You cannot destroy or alter federal records, and that's
Correct.
what they're doing.
Correct. Well, what's the, just closing out, what is the name of the book again?
The Liberal War on Transparency, subtitle, because they all have them, Confessions of a Freedom of Information, quote, criminal, close quote, for reasons explained. And you can get it in bookstores, Amazon, or at chrishorneronline.com.
And thank you, Chris Horner of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Darren.